Good morning. My name is Ralph Buehler. I'm an assistant professor in urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person today, but we are recording this presentation from our campus in Alexandria, Virginia. Before I start, I also want to acknowledge my co-presenter, John Pucher from Rutgers University, who can't be here because of scheduling conflicts. Our presentation today is titled Making Urban Transport Sustainable, Lessons from Germany. And I know that most of the lessons from this conference are geared towards developing countries. I think from Germany the main lesson is that transport policies can help make the urban transport system more sustainable. Specific lessons, however, would have to be tailored to each individual developing country. We are looking at German transportation today through a lens of a comparative approach, comparing Germany to the United States. And as you can see on this opening slide here, in Germany as in the United States, the automobile is larger than life. But you also notice that this car is placed on a pedestrianized area where we have pedestrians, bicycles, and a bus in the background. This shot was taken in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. And right behind the Brandenburg Gate, you have the new US Embassy. There are, of course, many dissimilarities between the two countries, but also many similarities that make policy lessons meaningful. And the systems of government that are both federal, with local self-government traditions, strong economies, very important automobile industries. I put a couple of logos up there. Two of the highest levels of car ownership in the world. Most adults have driver's licenses in both countries. They have extensive highway networks, the interstate highway system, and the German Autobahn system with many stretches without speed limits still. And much urban and suburban development or redevelopment in both countries happened since World War II in a period of rapid motorization. This slide shows you the trend in motorization since 1960. You see that the US always led Germany, and it's still today in 2010, Americans own about 40 to 45% more cars and light trucks per thousand. However, Americans drive for twice as many kilometers a year, 20,000 kilometers, compared to only 10,000 kilometers for Germans of car travel per year. Americans don't only drive for longer distances, they also drive for a higher share of trips. Here we see all the way to the left that in the United States, blue part of the bar, about 86% of all trips are by automobile, compared to Germany, only 58%. However, Germans are 4.5 times as likely as Americans to ride public transport, 10 times as likely to ride a bicycle, and 2.5 times as likely to make a trip on foot. We also see that Germany is not alone. There are many other European countries that are similar to Germany. Driving for a higher share of trips and for longer trip distances has sustainability implication. This graph highlights that looking at CO2 emissions from passenger transport, and on the lower x-axis we have the share of trips on foot, by bicycle, and public transport. On the y-axis going up we have the transportation CO2 emissions per capita. We see that the United States all the way at the top has about 3 times higher CO2 emissions from passenger transport per capita than the European countries, including Germany. Moreover, the trend is more favorable in Germany. Since 1990, CO2 emissions have decreased there by 15% from the transport sector, and in the United States we have an increase since 1990. Traffic is also safer in Germany, more fatalities per capita in the US, and many more fatalities, 4 to 5 times more fatalities for pedestrians and bicyclists per kilometer walked and cycled. US households spend more on transport than German households. US governments, that's all levels of government, also spend more on roads and public transport per capita than all levels of German government. If we look at public transportation, there's a much larger subsidy required in the US for operation than in Germany. In fact, 65% of operating in the US are subsidy, only 25% in Germany. And looking from a public health perspective, we have a obesity rate in the US that's twice as high as in Germany, mainly related from a transport perspective to less physical activity of walking, cycling, and public transport use. From travel behavior theory, we know which factors influence travel behavior. We know that with higher incomes, people drive more. However, here we see, if we look at that in both countries, as income goes up from the left to the right, we have increasing trip shares by automobile per day for both countries. However, even Germans in the highest income quartile all the way to the right drive for a lower share of trips as Americans in the lowest income quartile all the way to the left. We also know that more car ownership is associated with more car use. This graph shows you on the x-axis cars per household member at driving age. However, we see that in German households that have more cars than household members at driving age, we have about 36 kilometers of car use per day, which corresponds to the kilometers of daily car use for the United States for households that have half or fewer cars per driver. Similarly, if we look at population density, as population density increases from left to right, in both countries daily travel distance decreases. However, in the US, even households at high density, all the way to the right, drive about the same amount of kilometers per day as Germans in the lower density categories, all the way to the left. Some of you may think that trip distance explains a big part of that, and trip distance is important, but in both countries about a similar share of trips is shorter than a mile. That's 27% in the US, 31% in Germany. However, even for those short trips, Americans drive for 67% of those, compared to only 27% of Germans. As you see then, trip distance increase to the right of, going to the right of this graph. Car use in Germany also increases, but is lower than in the United States. We also have a trend in Germany for young adults towards less car use over the last decade. This graph shows you kilometer of daily car travel for age categories depicted on the x-axis for different decades. If we look at the orange graph here, that's for 1976, you see that the age category of 24 to 29 had the highest level of car use per day, and then it declined from there. For the red graph, the red area here, that's 1997, all age groups had increased their driving between 1976 and 1997. However, if we look at the blue line here, we see that in 2007, the age groups between 20 and 29 actually decreased their driving compared to 1997. So we have a trend towards less driving for young adults. The policy framework in Germany and the policies implemented on the local level play an important role in explaining lower levels of car use. The federal policies only provide the framework. The local policies on the ground often lead the way. On the federal level, we have taxes and regulation that make car use more expensive compared to the US. There was more funding, or has traditionally been more funding for walking, cycling, and public transport in the US. Land use planning is stricter and requires cooperation across levels of government and with other sectors of planning, such as transportation. There has been strategic leadership on the national level through federal level land use plans and transportation plans, but the specific policies were developed and implemented at the local level. The first federal policy that comes to mind is taxation of gasoline, which is about 8 times higher in Germany than it is in the United States. This shows you the gasoline price at the pump since 1990. We see increases in both countries, but we see that the curves are slightly diverging with higher prices in Germany. Part of this increase is explained by Germany's environmental tax reform. It was in place between 1999 and 2003. Every January 1st, the tax per gallon of gas went up 15 cents over 5 years to a total of 75 cents per gallon. At the same time, they reduced social security taxes, so people had more in their paychecks but had to pay more at the pump. In 2003, these successive increases were discontinued. However, it boosted the gasoline price permanently. If we look at the revenue collected from road users, these are tolls, taxes, registration fees, and expenditures on roadways, we see a very different picture for the two countries. If we're at the line of 1 here, the blue line, we would have the same amount of revenues collected from road users as expenditures on roads. We see that for both countries in 1975, we had net subsidies to roadways because the bars are below that line. However, starting in the mid-1980s, the orange bar, that's for Germany, shows that they collected more revenue from road users as they spend on roadways. In the US, we have a different picture. We have net subsidies for roadways all the way through. Most of the subsidies on the local level from your property taxes, but also more recently because the Highway Trust Fund had to be injected with general funds on the federal level. It's not just about making car use more expensive and restricting it, it's also about making other modes more attractive. This shows you Germany's regional public transport authority, and if you look at the Germany map, every little area you see on that map is one of these transit authorities. In all of these areas, all transit providers come together and they integrate fares and timetables across operators and across modes. As a user, you do not notice when you change from one company to another because you have one ticket, you have seamless transfers across the operators. Moreover, they offer steeply discounted monthly and annual tickets. Often, one trip with one of the monthly tickets or annual tickets is only 60% of the cost as a single fare. For students and the elderly, there are even steeper monthly and annual discounts. The goal is to improve the service and the connectivity to pull people into public transportation. More recently, German states have come in to provide statewide public transport tickets for off-peak use only, so it's off-peak or the weekend, for around 30 to 35 euros for up to 5 people to use transit in the entire state. Many German cities have at the same time expanded their public transport networks. That's the trolley network or light rail network in the German city of Freiburg. You see in black the net of public transport they had in 1970, and then you see the expansions after that. While expanding public transportation, they were keeping in mind that where residents live and where they work, and today about 80% of Freiburgers work or live within half a kilometer of light rail, making the city accessible by light rail. And this is not a large city, it's only 220,000 inhabitants, and they were able to sort of cluster most of their residences and workplaces around transit. Most German cities have increased the attractiveness of their buses, metros, and trams with low-floor boarding, big windows, real-time information at station, real-time information on vehicles to inform customers. While these upgrades were going on, financial efficiency of public transport operation in Germany actually went up, increasing from about 61% of farebox revenue as coverage of the operating cost to 78% in 2007. In the US, we only have about 37% of coverage farebox compared to operating cost, and being between about 33 and 40% over the last 2 decades. So more financially efficient public transport in Germany. This slide again from Freiburg shows you 2 important points. One is the integration of transit modes. So you have the main transit station here with the long distance and the regional rail, the bus station right across for easy transfers, and you have the light rail crossing across the main rail line for easy connections. At the same time, you also see a bike parking garage for 1,000 bicycles right next to the train station, which leads us to the idea of multimodal coordination or coordinating across modes. So we have these bike parking garages, like on the upper right-hand corner in Freiburg, the lower right-hand corner in Münster, where we have 3,500 bikes parked there next to the main rail station and the main bus station. You can also take bikes on trains, and then on the lower left we have more typical bike parking at regional. Over the last 40 years, German cities have experienced a bicycling boom, increasing level of cycling in all of these cities. You see here some from low levels like Stuttgart from 2% to 6%, others in very high levels like Münster from 29 to 35% of trips by bicycle. The cities achieved that mainly by building separate facilities such as bike lanes and bike paths for cyclists along roads with higher traffic volumes. This shows you the map of the city of Berlin and all their bikeway networks, mainly along major roads. At the same time, the city complemented these kilometers of separate facilities with traffic calming in neighborhoods for automobiles down to 30 kilometers per hour or even down to walking speed, 7 kilometers per hour, 3,800 kilometers of roads in Berlin are traffic calm. On these traffic calm streets, they don't provide separate bike facilities because speeds are considered slow enough for cars and bicycles to share. Berlin increased its bike share of trips from 5% to 10% over the last 20 years. In all German states, school children take cycling lessons in school. It's first in the classroom where you learn about traffic rules, then you ride your bicycle on little parcours with little traffic signs to learn about the traffic rules, and the policeman will be there to call on you if you make mistakes. Once you've mastered that, the police take children these days out into the real world to cycle on bike paths, lanes, and in traffic. It's important to give children the skills to cycle in traffic and put parents at ease that the children actually know what they are doing when they are cycling. On the other hand, there is strict driver's training. These are photos from the German written driver's training test. The photos I chose are all where cars have to yield to pedestrians or bicycles. Also during the real driving test, when you're on the road, they will also watch out that you actually consider the rights of pedestrians and cyclists. In the lower right-hand corner, you see that photo with the two kids saying goodbye. So if you approach a situation like that as a driver, you have to show that you're ready to brake, because that child may cycle into traffic without looking for you. It's not only about the modes of transport, it's also about land use planning and keeping trip distances short or densities high enough. In Germany, the land use planning evolves around a bottom-up, top-down approach. So there is land use planning on the municipal, regional, state, and federal level. On each level of government, the lower level of government is involved in making a plan, but once a plan is made, the lower level of government is bound by that plan. As you go down this ladder, the plans get more specific on the local level, with the zoning being on the local level. On the federal level, we only have general guidance, such as big goals like sustainability or a federal building or planning code, but no actual plan about where land uses are supposed to be built. On all of these levels, there's coordination with specialized planning such as transport, energy, or water. A prime example for that is the city of Freiburg, which redeveloped two brownfields, a sewage farm called Rieselfeld and a former military barracks called Vauban, into sustainable neighborhoods. Both of these neighborhoods are built around extended light rail lines and have traffic calmed most of their neighborhood streets, as you see here. So they give the streets over to children and pedestrians and not necessarily for automobiles. In Vauban, you can't even park permanently in the neighborhood, but you have to park overnight your vehicle outside in a special parking garage. One of the main points of this talk is that Germany has not always been that sustainable, but changes were made over time. And I brought a series of photos here showing you this. In the 1950s, at the VIDEO0012 bridge in Freiburg, we had a trolley line going over this bridge. By the 1960s, the trolley line had been torn out, was considered the mode of the past, and the bridge was automobile only. Due to policy changes today, this is a bicycle bridge, and automobiles are banned from the bridge. Similarly, the small German town of Lörrach, 50,000 inhabitants. In 1953, we had a trolley line in Lörrach, we had bicyclists, and we had automobiles. You also will notice this fountain here. By the 1970s, and there's the fountain again, they had torn down buildings for urban renewal, and they had given over most of this intersection to the automobile. You see pedestrians and bicyclists sort of crowded on the side. Today, this area, there's the fountain again to the right hand, this is a pedestrianized area only accessible on foot and by bicycle, and cars have to park outside. So what do we think are the main lessons from Germany? First, policies should be multimodal, including both incentives for walking, cycling, and public transport, and disincentives for driving. Implementing them at the same time also works probably best, because if you try to restrict driving, if you offer good alternatives, it's easier to implement the restrictions on driving, because drivers have an opportunity to get around without a car. So it's crucial to restrict car use, which is probably where US cities are lacking most in restricting automobiles at the moment. Many cities have pushed for walking, cycling, and public transport, but very few cities have restricted car use through traffic calming of residential neighborhoods, car-free zones in city centers, or limiting car parking in city centers. Support from higher levels of government was crucial, but most of the innovation actually happened on the local level of government. Controversial policies were often implemented in stages. For example, the eco-tax, the gas tax increases happened in increments over 5 years, and not one big tax increase all at once. Similarly, most traffic calming happened in neighborhoods that complained most about traffic first, and then when other neighborhoods saw the traffic coming and demanded it, it was expanded. Policies were long-term for lasting impact, so that's not a short process, not 5 years, not 10 years, but many German cities are doing this for 30, 40 years to change the transport system and travel behavior. So it has to be long-term for lasting impact. And lastly, integrating transport and land use is absolutely crucial to keep trip distances short enough for walking and cycling, and to keep densities high enough for financially efficient public transportation. With this, I conclude my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. Again, I'm sorry I can't be there and participate in the discussion. Greetings from Alexandria, Virginia, and goodbye.